Russia suffered a record number of casualties on the eastern line. Russian defensive line was badly damaged. Moscow took action to send new troops. Russian Ministry of Defense is very worried about the loss of control on the eastern front. Therefore, Sergei Shoigu had an urgent meeting with Belarus. Russia took action to form a new front from the north. Ukraine took great measures against attacks from the north. A large number of HIMARS and MURS missile systems were deployed on the eastern and northern fronts. Ukrainian army neutralized the entire Russian-backed group. The HIMARS attacks began. The tension is higher than ever. On the orders of Kiev, Ukrainian army began operations. A large operation was launched against Russian-backed troops in the Snezhnoye region. Ukrainian army neutralized at least 50 Russian military equipment and 70 Russian-backed group members in the region. In addition, armed forces of Ukraine regained control of 6 settlements. In this process, 17 Russian attacks were repelled and 5 Russian command centers were destroyed. In this process, 511 Russian soldiers were neutralized in one day. In addition, 2 heavy battle tanks, 4 armored vehicles, 9 unmanned aerial vehicles, and 7 Russian fuel tankers were destroyed. It was stated that Russian army suffered the greatest losses in the Donetsk region. In the last 24 hours, Ukrainian armed forces repelled the attacks of Russian troops near the settlements of Cherven-Opopivka in Luhansk Oblast and Solder, Opitin, Nevelsk, Krasnohorivka, and Marinka in Donetsk Oblast. Ukrainian Air Force carried out 17 attacks on personnel, weapons and military equipment clusters, and 3 attacks on the positions of Russian anti-aircraft missile systems. In addition, Ukrainian troops shot down an enemy helicopter and 6 Orlan 10 Type unmanned aerial vehicles. In addition, Ukraine's rocket forces and artillery announced the successful destruction of 5 command posts, 2 ammunition depots, 11 personnel and military equipment clusters, and 4 other important objects belonging to the Russian invaders. In this process, United States announced that the new HIMARS missile system and ammunition would be sent to Ukraine. Russia began to lose control on the eastern front. That's why Putin wants to involve Belarus in the war. Moscow sent a large number of air defense systems to Belarus and instructed to increase the number of Russian troops in the area. Russia wants to launch direct attacks on Kiev from the north. Ukrainian armed forces deployed a large number of air defense systems, military equipment, and soldiers in the northwestern part of the eastern front. Russia may launch simultaneous operations on the eastern front and in Kiev via Belarus. Russia could launch a major final attack on Kiev. Intelligence reports said that the number of Russian soldiers on the borderline had increased too much. But if Russia fails in these operations, it will lose the war. Moscow may want to advance with a major offensive, as it did in the early days of the war. In these attacks, Russian army will try every way to reach Kiev and therefore will inflict many casualties. In addition, Ukrainian soldiers who established a defense line in the region both know the region better and are much more experienced than Russian soldiers. In addition, considering that the Russian army could not control Kiev in the first days of the war, we can say that the biggest obstacle to progress is that Ukrainian army has much more military equipment than in the first days of the war of Russian army. In addition, Russian army had much more ammunition, guns, missiles, warplanes, tanks, and most importantly experienced soldiers in the early days of the war. On the other hand, Ukrainian army did not have enough military equipment. Despite this, Putin's troops were unable to gain control over Ukraine. If the Russians make such a mistake, they will lose the war and collapse economically. In this process, it seems likely that direct Ukrainian operations will start in the Crimea and Donbass regions. After this process, I don't think Russia has a chance to win the war. Moscow is aware of this, but Putin still thinks Russian army is far superior. So Putin can still make such a mistake. However, the Kremlin government thinks that by involving Belarus in the war, a success in Ukraine should be achieved. That is why Moscow constantly ships to Belarus. Russia's sending of a large number of air defense systems to Belarus was reflected in many video recordings. Belarusian Hagen news outlet reported this week that a large convoy of Russian military equipment was seen en route to Belarus. According to the report, at least 15 Tor-M2 surface-to-air missile systems and 10 construction machines were seen among the vehicles and weapons that went to the country located in the northwest of Ukraine. According to the news, the convoy of vehicles and weapons departed from Yeysk train station in Russia on the 25th of November and reached Orsha-Centalzhnaya, Belarus on the 28th of November. Vehicles and weapons were then transported to the Borisov station. Belarusian President Lukashenko stated that measures were taken against NATO countries. However, NATO and Western countries have declared that they will not be directly involved in the war. Russia and Belarus are thought to have a different plan in this process. In Poland, which has a border with Belarus, measures have begun to be increased. Putin wants to involve Belarus in the war. NATO's intervention came to the fore in case of attacks and sending troops to Ukraine via Belarus. NATO has stated that necessary measures will be taken in this regard. But as I mentioned, NATO has repeatedly stated that it will never be directly involved in the war. Tensions between Poland and Belarus continue to rise. Following the fall of an air defense missile in Poland, the measures on the border line were greatly increased. As a precaution against a possible illegal attack by Russia and Belarus, NATO began to increase its military presence in Eastern Europe. On the other hand, United States President Biden stated that he could meet with Putin about negotiations. However, Putin said Russian army would remain on Ukrainian soil even if talks could be held. After this process, Western countries announced that the negotiations could not progress, so defense systems would be sent to Ukraine. But Putin's assertive statements are inflicting incredible economic damage on Russia. Russia is trying to cope with a major economic crisis. In the process, Putin instructed Belarus to resume shipments. Kyiv said it would never sit at the negotiating table with Putin. "We will give the biggest answer to the Kremlin on the Kyiv front. We will continue our operations until the last Russian soldiers leave our lands," he said. Following the statements, European Union announced a ceiling price for oil purchases from Russia. The ceiling price published by European Union will greatly affect Russian economy. The published base price was rejected by Russia in the morning. The Kremlin reacted to the decision of European Union and G7 countries to impose a ceiling price of $60 per barrel on Russian oil transported by sea. Kremlin spokesperson Dmitry Peskov told reporters, "We are currently analyzing. We have preparations for this price ceiling. We will not accept this ceiling price and will quickly let you know how to organize this business after our analysis." Western countries have made agreements with many countries for alternative energy trade. Russia got its biggest income from energy and oil sales. Moscow was selling mostly oil and energy to European countries. But Europe has stopped buying both natural gas and oil. For this reason, it is said that Moscow will experience a major economic collapse in the coming months. Moscow says it imposes sanctions on European and Western countries. However, Russia will suffer the most in this process. Russian army, which has suffered great losses, will experience more difficult days with the collapse of the economy, because Russia has big problems in the production of ammunition and weapons. The collapse of the economy will cause these productions to decrease even more. After the statements made, the tension between Europe and Russia increased considerably.